Welcome to Vendor Trash. It's the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both. That's for you to decide. I miss Hearthstone. I haven't played it since its second year and the Whispers of the Old Gods expansion, save for the occasional WoW promotion that made me reinstall it for a bit. But it isn't because I don't enjoy the game, quite the opposite in fact, and I don't even mean to criticize the game that much. I really loved it when I did play. So why have I avoided such a fun game for the latter 80% of its lifespan? Well, we're going to be going off on some tangents here. This is probably the least WoW-oriented video I've put out so far, so fair warning. I've always had a love-hate relationship with trading card games. I collected a few super casually back in the day, like Pokemon, the short-lived Shaman King card game, and the various attempts at a Digimon card game, including the Digibattle card game that literally changed the rules from the Japanese Hyper Coliseum, changed the back of the cards after 2 booster sets, and shockingly didn't succeed. None of these I actually played, in part due to a lack of people to play with, though Digimon I could at least do in a war style based on each card's vaccine data and virus attacks. My love for card games really took off, as it did for many a weeb in the 2000s, with Yu-Gi-Oh! The anime was the perfect gateway into the game. Not for teaching you the actual rules, mind you. The anime didn't even have very consistent in-universe rules. Anyone who knows about the Catapult Turtle Dragon Champion maneuver can attest to that. And I was really bad at the game. I finally had friends who played this one who were probably similarly bad, though less so. Spell speeds, chains, and the difference between negating and deleting a card were often lost on me since the anime did a less than stellar job of spelling it out. But I still enjoyed it and made a teenager's attempt at collecting all of the cards, with it slowly dawning on me that that would be nigh impossible. The sets were coming out too frequently for me to ever catch up, and thanks to the sequel series, at the time GX and 5Ds, there was no sign of it coming to a stop despite the original manga adaptation being completed. I stopped keeping up with the game with the release of the Lost Millennium booster set. I revisited the game briefly in college before quitting permanently. By that point in time, the game had gotten absurdly faster, to the point that I didn't stand any chance at all when I attended a tournament, even if you were to factor out my low skill level. And the game has only sped up further since, because the game's primary resource is the cards themselves, and the cards have started to have an encyclopedia's worth of text on them. Each player's turn and options could go on absurdly long, especially with many cards requiring you to reshuffle your deck because you searched it for something. The game morphed, away from back and forth interactions, and into 2 players playing their own puzzle solvers. Hearthstone became my second great card game love, albeit a shorter-lived one. This time around, everything was digital, and that in many ways benefited the game. The most obvious being that you could play literally whenever without having to travel or even find people yourself. The rules were automatically enforced by the game, so you never accidentally cheated, and you would quickly learn if you misunderstood an effect. It was also much easier to manage your decks and collection. Heck, if there was a rare card you wanted for multiple decks, you still only needed the 1 or 2 copies. RNG elements could be utilized far more liberally, which, while not always positive, generally was and often made matters more fun. Other things were also possible, such as the game remembering everything that had occurred and being able to use that for effects, inserting cards into decks, and all sorts of other shenanigans that would be far more difficult in a physical medium. I had a lot of fun not only playing the game, but watching YouTubers like Krendor and Total Biscuit uploading their games. It also had a completely insulated economy. Card packs cost exactly what Blizz charged. No trading, no resale. On the upside, we could craft any card we wanted by disenchanting other cards, generally duplicates, but also any you just didn't care about. This was great in theory, but in practice had 2 big limitations. Legendary cards costing so much more dust than others, and the 100% dust rate when any card was changed. The latter was a very nice compensation, so nice in fact that I often hoarded my duplicates instead of dusting them right away, because you never know, which unfortunately kept me from crafting a lot of cards that I wanted to use. Plus, it was way more efficient to pull a card than craft it, so that was even more incentive to hold off. But I was actually okay with all of this, especially in Hearthstone's early life. I was behind, but I'd get there in time. I enjoyed their initial cadence of about 2 adventures and about 1 expansion per year. It felt like I could keep up. The card pool was growing, but at a manageable rate. Then they announced that they were switching to 3 full expansions per year, and I immediately dropped the game. This was, perhaps, being extremely unfair to the game. 3 expansions in a year is not a lot by TCG standards. But I had just recently relearned my lesson with Yu-Gi-Oh! And knew that this was an important fork in the road. I didn't want to invest more in a game that I knew I would come to be frustrated with and hate, so I cut my losses there. To Blizzard's credit, they did make some improvements, such as duplicate protection when pulling legendaries. Also of note, though it was after my departure, they implemented a set rotation in the game, where older cards get cycled out of the standard format and relegated to a far less balanced wild format. Personally, the idea of my old cards becoming unusable is really lame and I don't like it. I understand that there are merits to rotations, but honestly I find it to be completely unnecessary and just allows developers to be sloppier in their game design. My card game passion then went into dormancy for a long time thereafter, only being reignited a few years ago when an old friend of mine messaged me about Digimon's latest, and at least in the West, most successful attempt at a card game yet. It wasn't long before I was back on that boat and hooked. It is the card game that I have invested the most time, effort, and for better or worse, money into. Now, it cannot do all of the fancy stuff that a video game like Hearthstone can, but it's by far the best designed card game I've played, primarily due to the shared memory system. You can do whatever you want on your turn as long as you have the cards and the memory to pay for it. Once you move the memory gauge past 0, any pending effects resolve and your opponent's turn begins. It creates a very engaging back and forth and affords you a lot of choices. You can play that really expensive card whenever you want, but if you do, you'll be giving your opponent all the more memory to work with. Other strong points are the security system, which can enable some surprise comebacks and is essentially the reverse of Pokemon's prize cards, and the fact that searcher cards only hit the top of the deck, moving any misses to the bottom so that you don't have to shuffle mid-game. The memory and security make it the least curb-stompy game that I've played, and while this is more the result of my higher real-life assets, it's the game that I felt the most comfortable making multiple decks in. So that right there is my history with TCGs, but what are the main issues that I have with them? Where does the hate of my love-hate relationship come from? Well, there are 2 main sources. First off, there's overload, and I'm not referring to the Hearthstone Shaman mechanic. TCGs simply release at a pace that I'm not fond of. I usually don't get to engage with them on a regular basis, as I've rarely lived in range of a local game shop or close enough to friends who participate to do it more than every few weeks or months. So often, there may be 3 sets released between my game sessions, though even if I did play more frequently, I still think it would be too fast for me. I've never felt the meta getting stale, even in Hearthstone. I don't think it could unless I literally made a card game my main and borderline only hobby. And as a card game gets older, I start to simply feel overloaded. Financially overloaded by how hard it can be to keep up, spatially overloaded as it becomes more and more obtuse to store all my cards in an organized fashion, mentally overloaded as it becomes harder to keep track of the card pool and all of the relevant card effects, or even all of the effects being added to single cards, which all leads to me feeling increasingly stressed about an activity that was far easier to enjoy when it was smaller. It seems that every TCG I've engaged in has grown too quickly for me, so perhaps I'm just not the target audience. And the other big reason is power creep. Monsters in card games tend to start out relatively vanilla and weak, with few if any effects. Over time, they start to release stronger cards with better stats and more effects. There is some merit to this, of course, but most card game designers and even players seem to be oddly okay with the idea of power creep, that over time, cards are simply going to be designed to be stronger. And to be clear, I'm not considering synergy creep here, which is where cards almost accidentally get stronger because of interactions that didn't exist when they were first printed. power creep is basically the entire history of Yu-Gi-Oh!, with cards from even a year or two ago usually being completely outclassed by the absurdly higher potential of the newest releases. In Hearthstone's case, I'm not super well suited to comment, since I dropped out early and the first few sets when a game is finding its footing is when power creep is most excusable, but from what I've heard, it's been noticeable, particularly with quest cards that give you a massive advantage for the rest of the game once completed. And I distinctly remember the Grand Tournament adding Evil Heckler as a strictly better version of Booty Bay Bodyguard, and wondering what excuse they could possibly have for not simply buffing Bodyguard. It's a digital card game after all. It kind of showed their hand. Digimon has been relatively good about keeping power creep in check. It's definitely happening, but it's been quite gradual outside of perhaps a spike with BT9. That being said, there have been a few overtly busted cards that they had to know were overpowered on release. Cards like Magnamon X, who has absurdly good built-in protection, and Numamon X, that could insanely cheaply let you cheat out high-level cards from your trash. And there's been a recurring issue of powerhouse cards that are simply splashable into way too many decks for their own good. Some of the principal offenders here being Death Xmon, Shine Greymon Ruin Mode, and Medieval Gallantmon. So overall, it's been good, but the upward trend still induces a bit of anxiety. So why are so many people fine with power creep when it changes the game so much and starts to make old cards obsolete? Well, the rationale is that for the game to survive, new product must be sold. To sell product, you need to release cards that are better than the cards players already own. And I certainly agree that it's the most effective way to get players to spend money. But I vehemently disagree that it's the only way. Make no mistake, the main cause of power creep is to make money. Whether that is justifiable for the financial health of the game is up for you to decide, but it is absolutely not necessary to keep designing it. For this, I would point at most of the Digimon decks that I've put together in the past year or two. I constructed them just because they provide fun new mechanics and gameplay flows and feature some of my favorite mons. Lots of them were Ghost Game or Liberator decks like Jelly, Angora, Aquatic, Royal Base, Mineral, or the upcoming Medusa deck, as well as gimmicky decks like Mill and Hand Hate. None of these decks have really been at the top of the meta, not even close to my knowledge, but I happily bought and built them anyway because they offered horizontal growth to the game. If designers and players were more willing to embrace that, instead of focusing on vertical progression, power creep could be strongly mitigated. So then, what's my relationship with each of these games nowadays? When it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh!, I've comfortably left that behind me, but gained a recent renewed respect for the original manga and anime. It was a fun story about friendship, games, and not just the card game, and ancient Egyptian spirits murdering those who have wronged you. When it comes to Digimon, I'm still actively playing and hoping for the best. The sense of potential overload has and continues to loom over me, but I'm having fun when I do get to play. I hope I can navigate my relationship with it well going forward, and if I do find myself having to make my exit, which would really suck as it's a great social activity as well, I'll at least have a bunch of decks made that I can play with in the future. And I still follow a lot of Digimon media, especially any anime releases. It's a lifelong thing for me. And as for Hearthstone, I actually considered going back in recent years, since I heard that a classic mode was added, which isn't exactly what I was looking for, but would still be a fun time. But then, right around the time I was going to, they removed it. Evidently because it was unpopular and filled with bots, but probably also because it wasn't a mode that encouraged buying more cards. Either way, I've yet to reinstall, and have relegated myself to occasionally reminiscing about the fun times I had back in 2014. For this week's drawing, I had a few options that I could have gone with. I considered using Ragnaros, as he was probably classic Hearthstone's most iconic legendary card. A card which was fairly good, if not the absolute best, and which highlighted the appeal of Hearthstone's RNG elements. I also considered going with Cairn Bloodhoof, as he was the first legendary that I pulled out of a pack, but ultimately I decided to go with the second legendary that I pulled, Gruul, which was never considered a very good legendary, but I had fun with it. Just the idea of throwing out a big guy who gets bigger every turn, that's pretty cool, and accurately reflected his soft enrage mechanic from the Gruul's Lair raid in WoW. And I chose him mostly just because when the heck else am I gonna draw a giant Gron Lord? And I think Gron as a concept are kind of underappreciated. Before you get to Titan class characters, these are among the physically strongest races in the game. I think only really being bested by their own ancestors, the Magnaron, Genosaurs, the rivals to the Magnaron, and certain dragons. Like Gruul managed to fight Deathwing. He was losing that fight until he got assistance from Khadgar, but still, he was fighting Deathwing. Now, personality-wise, there isn't a whole lot to comment on. He's a big brute, what do you expect? But I've always really appreciated the Gron model. You could consider them Warcraft's take on a classical giant, and I feel you can really see and appreciate the Warcraft spin put into them. I put him in the most obvious place in the world, his own lair. Although that always made me kind of curious because he's almost too big for his own lair. Can he even get back outside? I imagine if he crawls on his belly, he could maybe squeeze through, but why would you put yourself into a cave that tight in the first place? Is he an idiot? Anyway, that's the video. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.